They're reacting to the mid-year economic review. Now, joining us to discuss the economic report is Taimur Baig, the chief Asia Economist at Deutsche Bank, and also Rathin, member of the 7th Pay Commission and the director at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, or NIPFP. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. Taimur Baig, let me start by asking you. The chief economic advisor said that the FY17 fiscal deficit target will be challenging. Do you think the review was making a case to renege on the 3.5% deficit target of next year?
I think there's a chance that they will. The underlying indicators are not particularly conducive toward achieving a sub 4% of GDP fiscal deficit, unless there is some significant cutback on fiscal spending, which is something I think this government is not committed towards. They feel that that is the only major impulse that the economy can receive support at this juncture. Therefore, in the presence of weak disinvestment revenue, in the presence of weak income tax revenue, there is a decent case to be made that the deficit should not be so sacrosanct, and then allowing it to go above 4% for this year, and perhaps not toward 3.5%, but a little higher next year is a reasonable thing to do. I think the key issue here is how the government communicates it, and the way they did it in the media review today, I think, was a good start.
All right, so you're saying the deficit may not necessarily have to be sacrosanct, but God forbid what the rating agencies are going to do if we renege on that promise. But Rathin, let me ask you and take that conversation forward as far as the fiscal challenges are concerned. The chief economic advisor in the mid-year review has now slashed the growth forecast from 8 to 8.5% to 7 to 7.5%. Nominal GDP has declined. While there is tax buoyancy as far as indirect tax collections are concerned, disinvestment, direct tax collections continue to fall lower than what the budget estimate was. In that context, then, do you believe that we are likely to see a fiscal slippage?
There is absolutely no reason for us not to meet the fiscal deficit target of 3.5% next year, as long as the growth projections for next year are met and the inflation target is met. That would mean effectively a real growth rate of around 7.5 to 8%. I'm talking about next year. And with an inflation target of 4%, that would give us a nominal growth rate of 12%.
But do you believe that that is going to be achievable given what we are seeing in the domestic situation at this point in time?
So without any incremental tax buoyancy and with current public expenditure parameters being maintained, it's a doable task.
Okay, you're saying that it is a doable task, but Taimur Baig, let me come to you. Is your base case that neither this year's 3.9% nor next year's 3.5% deficit target are likely to be met?
Yes, I think that the chance of the deficit not resting at 3.9 is fairly high. You can always do some window dressing, as we've seen in previous years, to achieve the arithmetic target. But I think we will all know on a substantive basis that what they were thinking about coming into this fiscal year and what they will achieve at the end would be different. But there, I think one important point needs to be made that, because India treats privatization above the line, we tend to overestimate the fiscal stance to some extent. Once you take that one-off away, the current budget year, the fiscal stance was actually slightly stimulatory. Even if they go above 4% of GDP, they might end up with a slightly contractionary fiscal stance. We need to keep that in mind.
Okay, but Rathin, let me ask you this, because the chief economic advisor said that given the fact that you actually have the base rate higher than the nominal GDP at this point in time, that we may need to reassess both our fiscal policy as well as our monetary policy. Is that an indication or a signal asking for aggressive rate cuts from the Reserve Bank?
Well, from a monetary perspective, I think the most important thing to do is what the governor has been trying to do, which is to try and make sure that reductions in interest rates are passed on substantially, if not in full measure. If we are actually able to do that, and we are able to see, let's say, by the end of next year, a 200 basis point cut in interest rates being passed on, then that is the maximum amount of monetary policy action you can take to stimulate demand. On the fiscal side, I'm afraid the government has left very little option, because the revenue deficit, notwithstanding what the chief economic advisor said, continues to be the driving force behind the overall fiscal deficit. The reason the government borrows continues to be principally to consume, and their medium-term roadmap does not show any significant change in that ratio. That being the case, in a sense, the government's fiscal deficit is already stimulating demand, and unfortunately, in that context, if the government intends to expand the fiscal deficit, it can only do so by increasing public investment but maintaining consumption expenditure.
But Rathin Roy, the Minister of State for Finance, Jayant Sinha, speaking to us, said that fiscal stimulus or stimulus of some sort will need to be provided, especially to the multiplier sectors. What will that mean then?
So in a nutshell, what I'm saying, I suppose, is that I do not see any argument for relaxing fiscal consolidation on the plea that the demand side needs to be stimulated.
Oh, okay, so you don't see any reason or an argument for relaxing the fiscal consolidation roadmap that we have. But let me ask you this, what would be the key risks at this point in time as you see them? Because we've got the domestic factors, we've got the global factors playing out as well. And inflation at 6% is what the report is suggesting at this point in time. So what can we see as the judicious mix between fiscal as well as monetary policy action?
I would need to question the analytical premise underlying that statement, and I cannot do that unless I see the argument in the report. However, it stands to reason that if inflation is contained at around 4%, then there is definitely room for interest rate reductions. But these interest rate reductions would need to be passed on and would need to be an important driver in stimulating investment demand. If investment demand is not being stimulated because the underlying economic conditions or institutional conditions or doing business conditions are not favorable, then as the Minister of State said, that will also need to be a major focus for such a stimulus to happen. That, in my view, the Minister of State is correct. I think the major reason why investment demand is muted is, apart from the global environment, is the sort of pause with bated breath to see a perceptible improvement in the ease of doing business and governance reforms. Those have begun to happen, and if those kick in next year, then I think that will be the primary focus for increasing investment demand. I think there's fairly limited room for fiscal policy to be used to do so.
All right, Rathin Roy, Taimur Baig, appreciate you joining us with your take on the mid-year economic review. In fact, news just coming in, flashing on your screens. This is according